Professor Dewald van Niekerk joins us now, an expert on disaster studies. Professor van Niekerk, good afternoon to you. The State of National Disaster Act, when it was written, was supposed to manage a sort of once-off extraordinary event, for example, a flood. It was supposed to really only be enforced for a short period of time. We've been living under it now for 2 years. I don't know if the people who wrote the legislation thought that this could happen, that it would be enforced for such a long time.
Hi, Stephen. No, definitely not. Initially, when the team sat and wrote that legislation, we looked at the worst-case scenario in terms of time, and the discussions was around a drought. And therefore, we implemented this 3 months period, which can be renewed, but never did we imagine that it would be extended for 22 odd times in a state of pandemic. But yes, it's extraordinary times in which we find ourselves, and I think we need to be reflective of how well we've done under the state of disaster and how robust this piece of legislation was in also assisting in mitigating the issue in which we find ourselves.
It seems to me, and I don't think we're the only country in this position, but it seems to me that it was pretty easy to decide to implement a state of national disaster. We'd seen what had happened in other countries. We all remember the videos in northern Italy of people passing away, the situation in their hospitals as the virus approached, as the virus took hold there. We knew the virus was in our country. So it was an easy decision to make. It seems to me that it's a much harder decision to make about when to end it, because there's so many different variables, and because the case for it is not as pressing, is not as strong as it was to implement it in the first place. So it's actually harder to decide to lift it than to bring it in the first place.
Oh, no, definitely. I mean, we are dealing with a situation of extreme risk. And, you know, hindsight is 2020, but we don't know what is happening in the following weeks and months to come. We don't know if there will be another variant. We're not quite sure of the intensity thereof. We can work on trends, and I'm sure there's quite a lot of scientific evidence which we can use in order to base a decision. But like you rightfully said, the government needs some kind of a legislative mechanism to enforce certain regulations. And what we now sit with is the regulations is driven by a state of disaster, and without the state of disaster, these regulations comes to naught. And therefore, the government does not have a hold on implementing regulations. And in my mind, that is the biggest and probably the only reason why we find ourselves still in a national state of disaster.
So, I mean, there are probably two measures that we certainly need to keep. I mean, we can debate this, and my view is certainly not absolute, but it's probably wearing face masks indoors in close contact and limiting mass gatherings indoors. I know under the Health Act, for example, you can make certain things mandatory, but without the state of national disaster, I don't know if you can introduce regulations to enforce those two things. Is that what you're talking about? There's no other legal mechanism at this stage, without amending maybe the Health Act, to enforce a ban on mass gatherings indoors? Yes,
it is. And regulations under the Health Act is not as clear-cut as you would find under the state of disaster. The minister can't just make these regulations on a whim. There's a certain oversight process that we need to go through that could take up to 3 months. They can fast-track that according to the Health Act. But if there's any opposition to us, as we will probably see, there will be people that oppose these regulations, that it will take us a bit longer. So I'll be surprised to see the state of disaster being lifted tomorrow.
There are other issues that come out of this. So, for example, you could argue that it actually doesn't matter. If you remove the state of national disaster, you end it now, Cabinet can really, with one virtual meeting, agree that it should be re-implemented, and the Minister of Cooperative Governance, it comes through her, but if I've understood it correctly, it's a Cabinet decision. But the Minister for Cooperative Governance would simply be able to sign the document. So does it really matter, I mean, if we remove it now, because it can be brought back at any time?
It can. It's not as easy as you say. A state of disaster can only be declared once it's been classified as such. And the classification rests on the definition of a disaster, and that must be done by the head of the National Disaster Management Center. So if the head of the center deems it fit according to the science at his or her disposal, he or she can decide whether to approach the minister to declare a national state of disaster. And then the minister would look at the evidence and then do that. So it's not a process of just cabinet sitting and deciding this. It must go through some technical process first.
So it's much easier to keep it in force than to bring it in again.
It is, because, you know, we've now learned a lot, and if the situation in which we might find ourselves in the future does not adhere to the definition of a state of disaster, it's going to be very difficult to argue that point in the courts. And with the amount of knowledge now behind the state of disaster that so many other parties have, you can definitely be ensured of the fact that people will start questioning every state of disaster that now comes along. So the facts must be on the table now. I believe it must be watertight. If we currently look at the definition of a disaster or state of disaster, and we look at where we are now, it's very difficult to justify that we are in fact still in a state of disaster. And these are the type of things that will definitely be challenged.
Oh, I can just see the court cases coming out of all of it. Is there not another problem, which may be that by remaining in a state of national disaster when there isn't really a need for one, I mean, to an extent based on what you've just said, but I think, you know, based on what the doctors and professors have said, perhaps on what they're saying too, is that people just ignore the regulations that are in force at the moment. And I think there's some evidence to show that people are doing that. There are not that many mass gatherings, sure, but if you keep it in force for too long, people just forget about it and start to ignore it, which weakens the entire act.
No, it does, and this is what's been happening for, well, fairly probably more than a year already. People do become complacent. We start to live with the idea of COVID. People don't find that it hits home so close as it did in the past, because we've been reaching some form of immunity and people have been vaccinated, etc., etc. So definitely people have totally ignored the regulations, and we might have to ask this question, does it make sense to keep these regulations intact? But what we should not forget is that government, and especially the disaster risk management fraternity, must focus on elements of risk, and therefore there's always the unknown. And we were quite good in implementing the state of disaster, and from the start the majority of the people felt that we did a good thing in doing that. But how it panned out later on, people became restless, and this is where we find ourselves again. We need to make very difficult decisions on unknown factors moving forward. But for all means and purposes, we also sit with a lot more scientific data that can help us make these decisions, and I think that must be used and used in conjunction with the unknown. And I believe a lot of these regulations can now be put to rest, and we can literally focus on the high-risk issues that we might face within the next 2 or 3 months. And we'll certainly, if it's a cyclical event that we sit with, we're going to know probably by the end of April and beginning of May if we're entering a new cycle. So we do have the evidence, we do have the monitoring in place. I believe we should be using that to inform future decisions.
Professor Dewald van Niekerk, thank you, Head of the African Center for Disaster Studies at Northwest University. Really appreciate the time. Well, we do expect